We're going to start Unit 4, the trigonometry unit. First two lessons, we're going to be dealing with SOHCAHTOA, which is the trigonometry involved in right-angled triangles, which everybody did, whether you came from 10 academic or 10 applied. In the second half of the unit, we're going to be looking at triangles that are not right-angled, and that will be for review for students from grade 10 academic and new for students from grade 10 applied. So, triangle trigonometry looks at solving for sides and angles in triangles. And the first 2 days we're going to be working on right-angled triangles. The first day we're going to be learning how to just solve for missing angles. Before we do that, we just need to remind you of how you label a triangle. The vertices, or the corners of a triangle, are labeled with capital letters. And one of the angles in a right triangle is a right angle triangle. Is a right angle, and then there are two other angles. One of these two angles will be what is called a reference angle, and it's usually used by the Greek letter theta, which is here. We often use the Greek letter theta to represent unknown angles, but it doesn't have to be. This could be called angle A as well. And how the three sides are labeled depends on whether the reference angle is at angle A or at angle B. Now, one thing that is always for sure is that the side opposite the hypotenuse, the side opposite the right angle is called the hypotenuse, and it is always the longest side of the triangle. Now, if the reference angle is here, the side that is not touching that angle is called the opposite side. So it is opposite that angle, and that's why it's called the opposite side. And then the third side, so one side is the hypotenuse for sure, opposite the right angle. One side is the opposite side, which is opposite the reference angle. And then the third side is called the adjacent side. Adjacent means next to. So if this is the reference angle, there are actually two sides that are next to that angle, but one will always be the hypotenuse. So the other one would be the adjacent side. And the three formulas for solving for angles and sides are here and here and here. There's three versions of it. We're going to go over all three of them. The first thing I need you to do is to make sure your calculator is in degree mode. On your screen, you should see a D or a DEG on it. If you see an R or an RAD, that means your calculator is calculating angles in the units of radians. And if it says G or GRAD, the units they're using is gradians. So you need to make sure your calculator is in degree mode. So I'll go over these formulas when we do an example. First of all, just make sure you know how to label the sides. So if we're solving for an angle, these are the steps that you're going to take. The first step is to know where your reference angle is. When you're solving for an angle, your reference angle will be the angle that you're solving for. So in this example, it says determine the value of angle X. So here is angle X. So this is your reference angle. The second step is to label the two sides you know with either opposite, adjacent, or hypotenuse. Now, there's three sides, but you're only given the values of two sides. So it's easier for you if you only label these two sides. Don't label this side, because if you label just these two sides, then you know it'll be easier for you to figure out which formula it is. So to start with, here's the right angle, and here is the side opposite the right angle. So that means that this side is the hypotenuse. So you can just label it with an H. And this is the reference angle. and this is the side opposite the reference angle. So that means that this is the opposite side. So you will know two of these sides, the opposite, the adjacent, the hypotenuse. You'll know two of those three sides. So now, based on the two sides you know, you're going to choose the appropriate formula. So we know the opposite and the hypotenuse. The opposite and the hypotenuse, so that means we're going to use this formula here. Sine theta equals opposite over hypotenuse. So that you're going to start with writing out the formula. Sine theta equals opposite over hypotenuse. You can write out the word opposite, or you could just put O over H. Now the next step is to substitute the numbers in. So in this step, instead of theta, the angle is actually called x, so we're going to substitute x in for theta. The opposite side is 5, the hypotenuse is 12. Make sure you line up your equal signs. So it's going to say, or read, sine x equals, the opposite side is 5, and the hypotenuse is 12. That's the substitution. The third step is to solve for the angle. To do this, you'll have to use your scientific calculator, and you'll have to use what are called the inverse trig keys. So above the sine button, you'll see it written sine, and it looks like a -1 exponent, but this is actually just called inverse sine. And above the cos button, you'll see cos, and it looks like an exponent of -1, so that's the cos inverse. And above the tan button on your calculator, you'll see tan inverse. And to get to the sine, cos, and tan, it depends on your calculator, but you'll either have to press the shift button or the second function button. It's usually a button that's in the top left of your calculator. So what you're going to do for that step is you're going to take, to solve for x, you're going to take the sine inverse of 5 divided by 12. Now, depending on your calculator, you're either going to press the sine inverse button first, then this bracket 5 divided by 12, or you're going to do the 5 divided by 12 first in your calculator and then press the sine inverse button. Usually it's this order, sine inverse of 5 divided by 12. So what you would type in your calculator would be shift or the second button, whichever your calculator is, and then press the sine key to get sine inverse, and then bracket 5 divided by 12, close the bracket, equals. Now this you're not actually going to write down on your paper when you do the test. You can write it down in your notes, but this you're not actually going to write down. This is what you type in your calculator. So that you don't actually write down on your test paper or whatever, the homework. And then some calculators, the shift or second sign would come after this. So if you try to do this in your calculator and you get an error, then switch these around. Do the bracket 5 divided by 12 bracket equals first, and then do shift sign or second function sign, whatever your calculator is. Either which way, you should get an answer of approximately 25 degrees. So the last step is to round your answer to the desired value. Usually angles are rounded to the nearest whole number. So again, if you try this in your calculator and you get an error, try doing the bracket 5 divided by 12, bracket equals first, and then do the shift sign. Now, if you have a word problem, there's a couple of pieces of language that you need to know. One is they might refer to an angle of elevation or an angle of depression. And usually in that case, you have one object down low and one object down high. So here the ship is down low and it's looking up at an airplane down high. So an angle of elevation would be at what angle is the ship looking up at the airplane? And an angle of elevation would be the angle that goes from the horizontal line and then goes up to the line of sight. So the angle goes up like this, from the horizontal up to the line of sight, and that is called the angle of elevation. Now an angle of depression would be the opposite. It would be what angle is the plane looking down at the ship. Now a lot of people make a mistake and make this the angle of depression. But again, just like an angle of elevation goes from the horizontal up to the line of sight, an angle of depression would go from a horizontal line down to the line of sight. So that would be the angle of depression there. Now, when you go to complete a word problem, the first step is going to be to draw the picture if necessary. Picture has already been drawn, but now we have to label it with all the information we know, plus the variable we're solving for. So it says a plane is cruising at an altitude of 30,000 feet. As it comes in for a landing, it travels 246,048 feet horizontally before it lands. So the altitude is 30,000 feet, so that's this side. And it travels 246,048 feet horizontally. So that means it's not this side. It covers a horizontal distance here of 246,048 feet. We also need to label that this is a right triangle. And lastly, it's asking for what is the angle of depression. So a lot of people will make the mistake and put the X here, but the angle of depression goes from the horizontal, which is imaginary in this case, a horizontal, and then down to the line of sight. That means the X is here. And then because of the Z pattern, an angle of depression is actually the same thing as an angle of elevation. Now to solve this, you're going to use the same steps that we did above. Mark your reference angle. Reference angle is right here. Label the two sides you know. So this 30 is opposite the reference angle, so that is the opposite side. And the other side, that's either the hypotenuse or the adjacent. Well, this side is opposite the right angle, so that's the hypotenuse, which would make this side the adjacent. Because remember, two sides are touching X, and the two sides that are touching X, one is the hypotenuse, which is this one, and the other one is the adjacent. So this side here is the adjacent. Third step is to pick your formula. So because we're using opposite and adjacent, we're going to use the tan formula. So our formula will be tan theta equals opposite over adjacent. Substitute your values in. Instead of theta, we're using x. The opposite is 30,000, and the adjacent is 246,048. To solve it, so line up your equal sign. To solve for x, because we're using tan, that means we're going to take tan inverse of 30,000 divided by 246,048. And in your calculator, you're going to press shift or the second function key, tan, to get that tan inverse. Bracket 30,000 divided by 246,048. And you're going to get that the answer is approximately 6.95, which would mean that would round to 7 degrees. And of course, since it's a word problem, therefore the angle of depression is approximately 7 degrees. Now, to help you remember the formulas, we have this word here called SOHCAHTOA. So SOHCAHTOA helps you remember the formulas because the SOH stands for sine equals opposite over hypotenuse. And then the CAH stands for cosine, or cos equals adjacent over hypotenuse. And TOA stands for tan equals opposite over adjacent. So that corresponds to these formulas here. The other thing you need to know is that sine, S-I-N, actually is short form for sine. Cos is actually short for cosine. And tan is short for tangent.